My mom told me, "Don't come home for Thanksgiving. Your brother doesn't want drama." So I ate at a restaurant alone. The family at the next table invited me to join them. 5 years later, they legally adopted me. My real parents found out at my wedding. Before I tell you about the absolute shock on their faces and how I finally took back my life, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Take a second, grab a warm cup of coffee, and listen to the story from the very beginning. The late afternoon sun was hitting the Napa Valley vineyard just right, casting this incredible golden glow over the rolling hills and the perfectly aligned rows of grapevines. We had rented out this gorgeous, rustic stone estate for the reception. Inside, the ceiling was vaulted with massive exposed wooden beams, draped in warm string lights and cascading white floral arrangements. It was, without a single doubt, the greatest day of my life. I was 32 years old, wearing a sharp tailored suit, and sitting next to my beautiful bride, Chloe. The clinking of crystal glasses had finally settled down. The hum of 150 guests, friends, colleagues, and the new family I had chosen, faded into a respectful silence. I stood up from the head table, brushing a hand down my jacket, and picked up the microphone. I looked out at the crowd, feeling a profound sense of peace. I was ready to give my groom's speech. I took a deep breath, looking right at Chloe, whose eyes were already shining with happy tears. Then, the heavy oak doors at the back of the reception hall flew open with a violent, echoing crash. The sound was so loud and abrupt that several guests actually jumped out of their seats. The soft acoustic guitar music that was playing in the background was instantly cut off by the sound technician. Every single head in the room turned toward the entrance. Standing right there in the doorway, completely uninvited, breathing heavily, and looking absolutely furious, were three people I had not seen or spoken to in 5 years. My biological mother, Margaret, my biological father, Charles, and my older brother, Gabriel. The air in the room instantly evaporated. I felt the microphone heavy in my hand. Chloe gasped, her hand flying to cover her mouth. My mother led the charge. She pushed her way past a terrified-looking waiter holding a tray of champagne, her expensive heels clicking aggressively against the polished hardwood floor. She was wearing a dark, formal dress that looked completely out of place for a summer vineyard wedding. Her face twisted into a mask of pure indignation. Gabriel was right on her heels. He looked older, heavier, but he still carried that same arrogant, entitled swagger he had always possessed. His jaw was set tight, his hands balled into fists at his sides, looking like a bouncer ready to throw someone out of a club. My father, Charles, trailed behind them both, his shoulders slumped. He kept his eyes glued to the floorboards, refusing to make eye contact with anyone in the crowd, looking exactly like the coward I remembered him to be. They marched straight down the center aisle, splitting the sea of my completely bewildered guests. "What is the meaning of this, Nathan?" my mother shouted. She didn't care that there were over 100 strangers watching her. She had always believed she was the main character of every room she entered. Her voice echoed off the high stone walls, sharp and piercing. "You get married, you have this massive, extravagant wedding, and you don't even invite your own family? We had to find out from a cousin's Facebook post." A Facebook post? Nathan. A low murmur rippled through the tables. People were shifting uncomfortably in their chairs. Gabriel stepped out from behind her, pointing a thick finger directly at my chest. "You think you can just erase us, man? You think you can just throw a party and pretend you don't have blood relatives? We're your parents and your brother. You owe us respect. You owe us an explanation right now." I stood perfectly still on the stage. I didn't flinch. I didn't step back. I didn't break out into a cold sweat like the old version of me would have. I just looked down at the three people who had spent my entire childhood and young adult life making me feel like an absolute burden. My mother crossed her arms, glaring up at me, waiting for me to shrink, waiting for me to apologize and beg for their forgiveness so they could take over the narrative, just like they always did. Instead, I smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was a calm, cold, deeply satisfied smile. I knew that smile would infuriate them more than any screaming match ever could. I tightened my grip on the microphone. I was not the same broken, desperate, people-pleasing kid they had thrown out into the cold 5 years ago. I had built an empire of my own, surrounded by people who actually loved me. "You're right," I said, my voice echoing through the speakers, calm and steady. "I didn't invite you, because you haven't been my family for a very long time." My mother's jaw dropped. Gabriel took a threatening step toward the stage. But to truly understand the pure, satisfying justice of what happened next in that reception hall, how I legally and publicly removed these people from my existence and watched their entire world crumble, you need to understand the hell they put me through. You need to know exactly why I blocked their numbers. You need to know about the phone call that finally severed my ties to them, and the dinner with absolute strangers that saved my life. It wasn't always massive, public explosions. In fact, for the first 27 years of my life, the rejection was quiet. It was insidious. It was a slow, agonizing drip of being told, over and over, that my feelings, my milestones, and my very existence simply did not matter. In our house, there was a very clear hierarchy. Gabriel was the golden child. He was older by 3 years, he played varsity sports, he was loud, and he demanded constant attention. My parents, especially my mother, revolved their entire universe around him. I was the spare part. I was the kid who was expected to stay out of the way, keep my grades up without asking for help, and never, ever cause an inconvenience. I remember my 16th birthday clearly. It was the first time I fully realized how little space I occupied in their hearts. Turning 16 is supposed to be a big deal. For months, I had been looking forward to it. I didn't ask for a car or a massive party. I just wanted to invite 5 of my closest friends over on a Saturday afternoon. We were going to order pizzas, play video games in the basement, and maybe watch a couple of movies. Because I knew my parents hated spending money on me, I had actually paid for the food and snacks myself. I spent the entire summer mowing lawns in our neighborhood, saving up crisp $10 bills in an old shoebox under my bed just so I could host my own birthday without being a financial burden. The morning of my birthday, I woke up early, buzzing with excitement. I carried bags of chips and soda down to the basement, setting up the controllers. When I walked upstairs to the kitchen, the atmosphere was thick with tension. My mother was pacing back and forth, her phone pressed to her ear. Gabriel, who was 19 at the time and home visiting from his freshman year of college, was sitting at the kitchen island, staring blankly at his laptop screen with his head in his hands. My mother hung up the phone and turned to me. She didn't say happy birthday. She didn't even smile. "Nathan, you need to call your friends right now and tell them not to come over today," she said. Her voice was entirely flat, leaving no room for discussion. I froze, my hand resting on the refrigerator door. "What? Why? I bought all the food. They're literally going to be here in 2 hours." "Your brother just checked his student portal," she snapped, gesturing toward Gabriel. "He failed his calculus final. He is completely devastated. He needs a quiet house to process this and study for his makeup exam next week. You having a bunch of loud, obnoxious teenagers screaming in the basement is completely insensitive to what he's going through." I stared at her in disbelief. "Mom, it's my 16th birthday. I planned this for weeks. I paid for it." Gabriel finally looked up from his laptop, rolling his eyes dramatically. "God, Nathan, does the world always have to revolve around you? Can you stop being so selfish for one single day? My entire college fund is on the line here. If I lose my academic scholarship, Dad is going to have to pull from his retirement. This is serious." My father walked into the kitchen right at that moment, adjusting his tie. He worked long hours at a corporate firm and hated dealing with household conflict. I looked at him, desperately hoping he would step in and defend me. "Dad, come on," I pleaded, my voice cracking slightly. "It's my 16th. We'll stay in the basement. We won't make a sound. Please." My dad sighed, rubbing his temples like I was giving him a migraine. "Look, Nathan, just do what your mother says. Your brother is under a lot of pressure. Keep the peace. Okay? We'll celebrate your birthday another time. Keep the peace." That was the family motto. And keeping the peace always meant Nathan sacrificing what he wanted so Gabriel could be comfortable. I walked back up to my bedroom, sat on the edge of my bed, and made 5 humiliating phone calls to cancel my own party. I spent my 16th birthday sitting alone in my room, listening to the agonizing silence of the house. Around 6 o'clock that evening, I heard the front door open and close. I looked out my window and watched my parents and Gabriel get into the car. They were taking him out to an expensive steakhouse downtown to cheer him up after his stressful exam news. They didn't even ask if I wanted to come. You try to tell yourself that things will change when you grow up. You convince yourself that their favoritism is just a phase of childhood. You think that if you achieve enough, if you work hard enough, if you become a successful adult, they will finally look at you, see your worth, and be proud. I worked incredibly hard to prove myself. When it was time for college, my parents sat me down and explained that they had drained every spare cent they had to pay for Gabriel's expensive private university tuition and his endless living expenses. There was nothing left for me, not a single dollar. I didn't argue. I enrolled in a local state school. While Gabriel spent his weekends going to fraternity parties and taking ski trips funded by my parents' credit cards, I worked night shifts at a logistics warehouse. I loaded boxes onto trucks from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m., slept for 3 hours, and then went to my graphic design classes. I lived on cheap ramen noodles and instant coffee. I took out student loans to cover the rest. Through sheer grit and exhaustion, I maintained a 3.9 GPA. When graduation day finally arrived, I was actually excited. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had accomplished something massive. Not only was I graduating with honors, but I had just signed a contract for an incredible entry-level job at a top-tier design firm in Boston. The salary was more than I had ever seen in my life. I had a clear path to a promotion within the first year. I was so eager to share this news with them. I mailed my parents the official graduation tickets 3 months in advance, explicitly marking the date on their calendar during a visit home. They promised me, looking me dead in the eye, that they would be there. The graduation ceremony was held in the university's massive outdoor football stadium. It was late May, and the heat was absolutely blistering. I sat in my black polyester gown, sweat dripping down my back, surrounded by thousands of other students. As the speeches dragged on, I kept looking over my shoulder at section 104, row G. That was where my tickets were assigned. Every time I looked, the 4 seats were completely empty. When the dean finally called the graphic design majors to line up, my heart started to sink. I walked up the ramp to the stage. I heard the announcer read my name through the massive speakers. Nathan Carter, graduating with high honors. I paused at the center of the stage, holding my diploma cover, and scanned the crowd. Other students had families blowing air horns, holding up massive cardboard signs with their faces on them, screaming their names. I looked at section 104, empty. I smiled a tight, painful smile for the professional photographer, shook the dean's hand, and walked down the steps. The lump in my throat was so massive I could barely swallow. I walked back to my folding chair and stared at the grass for the rest of the ceremony. They finally showed up 2 hours later. The stadium was practically empty. Janitors were already picking up crushed water bottles and confetti from the bleachers. I was standing by my beat-up Honda Civic in the parking lot, holding my gown over my arm, about to just drive home alone. My parents' car pulled up. My dad stepped out holding a cheap, sad-looking bouquet of flowers wrapped in crinkly plastic that he had clearly just grabbed from a gas station checkout line. My mother stepped out of the passenger side. She didn't look rushed. She didn't look guilty. She looked mildly inconvenienced. "Sorry we're late, Nathan," she said, waving her hand dismissively as she walked over. She gave me a stiff, one-armed hug that barely lasted a second. I looked at them, my vision blurring slightly. "The ceremony ended an hour ago. You missed the whole thing." I walked across the stage to an empty section. My mother sighed heavily. "Oh, don't start with the guilt trip, Nathan. Gabriel and Victoria found a beautiful new house they want to buy in the suburbs. The housing market is crazy right now, and they needed us to come to the bank this morning to co-sign the mortgage documents. We couldn't just leave them hanging. The appointment ran long. Gabriel had married Victoria 2 years prior. Victoria was a master manipulator who played the victim in every scenario, and she had my mother wrapped completely around her finger. "You missed my college graduation," I said, my voice trembling with suppressed anger. "A day I've worked 4 years for. Because Gabriel was looking at a house. It's just a piece of paper, Nathan," my mother snapped, her eyes narrowing. "Gabriel's future is a massive financial commitment. Plus, Victoria's parents are going through a really nasty divorce right now, and she is under a lot of emotional stress. We had to be there to support them. Stop making everything a tragedy." I didn't tell them about my new job. I didn't tell them about the salary. I didn't tell them about the promotion track. I realized, in that hot asphalt parking lot, that no matter how high I climbed, they would always be looking in Gabriel's direction. I took the cheap flowers, threw them in the back seat of my car, and drove back to my apartment. But the final breaking point, the moment that shattered the illusion of my family forever, didn't happen until I was 27 years old. It was late November. The Boston air was freezing, the sky a perpetual shade of bleak gray. I was standing in my tiny, overpriced studio apartment, packing a duffel bag. My flight to Connecticut for Thanksgiving was the very next morning. I had bought a pumpkin spice candle, letting it burn on the kitchen counter, trying to force myself into the holiday spirit. I hated going home for the holidays. It always meant sitting at the far end of the dining table, picking at my food, while my parents bragged endlessly about Gabriel's promotion or Victoria's new interior design choices. But it was Thanksgiving. It was family. You go home. That's the rule. I was folding a heavy winter sweater when my phone buzzed on the counter. The caller ID showed my mother's name. I tapped the speakerphone button so I could keep packing. "Hey, Mom," I said casually. "Just finishing up packing. My flight lands around noon tomorrow, so I should be at the house by 2. There was a brief silence on the line. Then, her voice came through, sharp, cold, and carrying that familiar tone of absolute authority. "Nathan," she said, "I'm calling to tell you not to come home this year." My hands stopped moving. The sweater slipped out of my grip and fell onto the hardwood floor. I stared at the phone. "What?" I asked, completely confused. "What are you talking about? My flight is tomorrow morning. The ticket is non-refundable. Gabriel and Victoria are hosting Thanksgiving at their new house this year," she said smoothly. There wasn't a hint of hesitation or remorse in her voice. "Victoria is pregnant, as you know, and she's been dealing with a lot of fatigue and morning sickness. Gabriel called me this morning. He said he doesn't want any drama this weekend. He just wants a peaceful, quiet holiday for his wife." I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter. My knuckles turned white. "Drama? Mom, what drama do I cause? I literally sit in the corner, eat my turkey, and barely speak a word to anyone. You always make things tense, Nathan," she snapped, instantly going on the defensive. "You always come in with this dark cloud over your head. You're always sulking or acting like a victim because Gabriel has a nice house. Victoria is very sensitive to negative energy right now. Gabriel wants a positive environment for the baby. It's better if you just stay in Boston. You're uninviting me from my own family's Thanksgiving because Victoria is pregnant?" I asked. My voice was shaking. It was a terrifying mix of blinding rage and a deep, profound, agonizing hurt that cut straight to my bones. "Stop making this about you," she yelled through the speaker. "This is exactly the kind of selfish behavior Gabriel is talking about. We will call you on Thursday afternoon to say happy holidays. Just have a quiet weekend." The line went dead. She hung up on me. I stood in my kitchen for a full 10 minutes, completely paralyzed. The hum of the refrigerator sounded deafening. The smell of the pumpkin candle suddenly made me feel violently nauseous. I picked up my phone again. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock the screen. I dialed my father's number. It rang 4 times before he picked up. In the background, I could hear the loud, energetic voices of sports announcers calling a college football game. "Hey, Nathan," he said casually, like the world hadn't just collapsed around me. "Dad?" I breathed out, leaning heavily against the counter. "Did Mom tell you? Did you know they're banning me from Thanksgiving?" There was a long, agonizing pause. The football announcers kept yelling on his television. "Yeah, son," he said quietly, his voice dropping in volume. "She told me." "And you're just going to let her do that?" I asked, my voice cracking. I hated how I sounded in that moment. I sounded like a terrified little boy begging for protection. "I bought a ticket, Dad. I'm your son. Are you really going to let Gabriel and Victoria push me out of my own family?" Another long silence. I could picture him perfectly. He was sitting in his expensive leather recliner, staring blankly at the TV screen, avoiding the reality of his own pathetic life. He had spent his entire marriage letting Margaret dictate every breathing moment of our household. He was terrified of his wife, and he was terrified of Gabriel's explosive temper. "Listen, Nathan," he finally said, his voice flat, completely devoid of any paternal instinct. "It's Gabriel's house this year. You know how Victoria gets when she's stressed. It's her first pregnancy. I think it's better if you just listen to your mother. We'll send you a gift card for a nice dinner in the city or something. Let's just keep the peace. All right?" Keep the peace. Those 3 words. They were the poison that had slowly killed my childhood. They were the excuse for every single time I was pushed aside, ignored, and neglected. "Right?" I whispered into the phone. The tears I was fighting back suddenly vanished. The sadness completely burned out, leaving nothing but a cold, hollow emptiness in my chest. "Keep the peace." I hung up the phone without saying goodbye. I walked over to the trash can under the sink, opened the lid, and dropped my printed boarding pass right on top of the wet coffee grounds. I didn't throw anything against the wall. I didn't scream. I just felt dead inside. They didn't want me. They never did. Thanksgiving morning in Boston arrived gray, bitter, and aggressively cold. Snow had started falling overnight, blanketing the city streets in a thick, icy layer. I woke up around 9 a.m. to the muffled sounds of life happening above me. I could hear my upstairs neighbors laughing. I could hear heavy footsteps running across the floorboards, the scraping of dining chairs being pulled out, and the unmistakable, rich smell of roasted turkey and garlic drifting down through the air vents. Everyone was with someone. Everyone had a place to belong. Everyone except me. I made a cup of instant black coffee, wrapped myself in a blanket, and sat on my old, worn-out couch. I made the absolute worst mistake a lonely person can make on a holiday. I opened my phone and tapped on social media. The very first post at the top of my feed was from Victoria. It was a high-resolution, perfectly filtered picture of the massive, custom-built mahogany dining table in Gabriel's new house. The table was covered in fine china, expensive crystal wine glasses, and massive, steaming bowls of food. Sitting around the table were my mother, my father, Gabriel, Victoria, and Victoria's parents. They were all holding up their glasses, smiling huge, picture-perfect, teeth-baring smiles for the camera. The caption read, "So incredibly thankful for my amazing, perfect family, surrounded by the people who matter most. Counting our blessings today. #family first, #blessed." I stared at the screen. I zoomed in on the picture, panning across the table. I counted the chairs. There were exactly 6 chairs, 6 place settings, 6 plates. They hadn't just uninvited me. They hadn't even bothered to leave an empty chair for me. They didn't set a place just in case. I was completely, fundamentally erased from their lives. I didn't exist. I threw my phone onto the couch cushion. A dark, suffocating wave of depression threatened to pull me under. I could have stayed in that apartment all day. I could have ordered bad Chinese takeout, watched sad movies until my eyes burned, and let the bitterness completely consume me. That's what the old Nathan would have done. But a sudden, intense wave of defiance washed over me. No, I refused to sit in the dark and rot while they drank expensive wine and celebrated my absence. If I was going to be alone, I was going to do it out in the real world. I was not going to hide. I put on my heavy winter coat, wrapped a thick wool scarf around my neck, pulled on my boots, and walked out into the freezing snow. The streets of Boston were like a ghost town. Almost every business, coffee shop, and bodega was dark, closed for the holiday. After walking for about 20 minutes, my face completely numb from the biting wind, I saw a warm, glowing neon sign cutting through the snowfall. It belonged to a place called Harborview Grill. It was an old, classic American restaurant, the kind with dark wood paneling, brass light fixtures, and booths upholstered in deep, worn red leather. When I pushed through the heavy double-glass doors, the heat hit me instantly, wrapping around me like a blanket. Along with the heat came the incredible, mouth-watering smell of roasted meat, savory gravy, and fresh baked bread. The restaurant was surprisingly packed. Everywhere I looked, large families were huddled around tables. There were grandparents laughing with toddlers, teenagers rolling their eyes, couples sharing bottles of wine. The air was thick with the loud, chaotic hum of conversation and clinking silverware. The hostess, a young girl with a sympathetic smile, looked at me as I approached the wooden stand. "Happy Thanksgiving. Just one today?" she asked gently. "Yeah," I replied, forcing a polite smile. "Just one." She led me to a small, cramped, wobbly table in the very back corner of the restaurant, right near the swinging doors of the kitchen. It was the kind of table they usually reserve for busboys to stack dirty plates, the kind of table you give to people you don't want anyone else to see. I sat down, kept my heavy coat draped over the back of the chair, and stared blankly at the single menu in front of me. Right next to my tiny table was a massive, sprawling booth that had been pushed together with two other tables to accommodate a huge group. There were older parents sitting at the head, a couple of guys around my age, their wives, and 3 little kids running around creating absolute chaos. They were loud. They were messy. They were passing baskets of bread back and forth, arguing loudly about sports, and laughing from their guts. They looked incredibly happy. The waiter eventually came over and brought me a plate of the Thanksgiving special. Slices of white meat turkey, a mound of stuffing, and a side of cranberry sauce. It looked delicious, but my stomach was tied in a knot so tight I felt sick. I picked up my fork and just stared at the brown gravy slowly cooling and congealing on the meat. I felt like a total loser, a pathetic 27-year-old man, sitting in a dark corner, watching other people live the life he was explicitly denied. I put my fork down and closed my eyes, just wanting the day to be over. "Excuse me, sweetheart." I blinked and looked up. Standing right next to my small table was the older woman from the large, chaotic group beside me. She had warm, crinkling eyes behind silver-rimmed glasses, elegant silver hair pulled back, and she was casually holding a half-empty glass of red wine. I quickly sat up straight, feeling my face flush. "Oh, I'm sorry. Am I in your way? Do you need me to move my chair?" She smiled. It wasn't a polite customer service smile. It was a genuine, deeply comforting smile. "No, not at all. I just couldn't help but notice you sitting over here by yourself. Are you doing okay?" I cleared my throat, wiping my hands on my napkin. "I'm fine. Just, allergies." The cold wind outside really got to my eyes. She raised a single eyebrow, looking down at my completely untouched plate of food. Allergies don't usually make a young man stare at his turkey like it personally betrayed him. A short, unexpected laugh escaped my lips. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to a mother," she said softly. She held out her free hand. "I'm Martha. Martha Morrison." "Nathan," I said, shaking her hand. Her grip was firm and warm. Martha looked back at her loud table, where one of the kids had just spilled a glass of water, causing a minor uproar. Then she looked back at me. "Nathan, my husband Joseph and I have a strict rule in our family," she said. "Absolutely no one should have to eat alone on Thanksgiving. We have way too much food, and honestly, we could use a buffer between my 2 sons before they start arguing about the Patriots game again. Why don't you bring your plate over and come sit with us?" I was stunned. I actually looked over my shoulder to see if she was talking to someone behind me. People in the real world didn't do this. "Oh no, Mrs. Morrison, I couldn't. I really don't want to intrude on your family time. I'm totally fine here, really." Before she could answer, the older man at the head of the table, Joseph, turned around in his chair and waved a half-eaten dinner roll at me. "Son," Joseph called out, his voice booming over the restaurant noise. "When my wife makes a decision, it's legally binding. Grab your plate and get over here before the grandkids eat all the good stuffing." I looked at my empty, depressing corner table. Then I looked at the open chair Caleb, one of the sons, was pulling out for me at their table. For the first time in my entire life, someone was actively making room for me. They weren't asking me to shrink. They were inviting me in. I picked up my plate and walked over. The moment I sat down, the dynamic of the table didn't shift. It didn't get awkward or quiet. They just absorbed me into the chaos like I had always been there. Joseph poured me a generous glass of expensive red wine without even asking. Sitting across from me was Caleb, who immediately started complaining to me about his terrible fantasy football drafted team like we had been best friends for a decade. His wife, Sarah, kept passing me plates of warm rolls, roasted vegetables, and extra gravy. "So, Nathan," Joseph said, leaning back in his chair and unbuttoning his suit jacket, "what brings a young guy like you to Harborview Grill by yourself on a day like today? You working a late shift at the hospital or something?" I hesitated. Whenever coworkers or acquaintances asked about my family, I usually lied. I made up stories about missed flights or snowstorms or conflicting work schedules to protect my parents' reputation. I never wanted people to know the truth. But looking around this table, at these strangers who had shown me more genuine warmth and hospitality in 10 minutes than my own blood relatives had in 27 years, the truth just spilled out of my mouth. "My mother told me not to come home," I said quietly, staring down at my wine glass. I felt my chest tighten. "My older brother is having a baby. They said they didn't want the drama of having me around. So, I stayed in my apartment in Boston." The entire table went completely quiet for a second. Caleb stopped chewing his food. Joseph slowly set his wine glass down on the table. Martha looked at me from across the table. Her eyes were incredibly sharp, intelligent, and perceptive. "Can I tell you a secret, Nathan?" she asked, leaning forward slightly. "I spent 35 years working as a family court lawyer. I handled everything. I've seen every kind of messy divorce, every bitter custody battle, every fight over an inheritance you can possibly imagine. I have seen the darkest parts of human families." She paused, making sure I was making eye contact with her. "And if there is one universal, undeniable truth I've learned in all those years in the courtroom, it's this: the person in the family who is constantly complaining about drama is almost always the one creating it." I looked up at her, my breath catching in my throat. "They said I make things tense. My mom said I'm the problem." "You are not the problem, Nathan," Martha said firmly. She didn't say it with pity. She didn't say it to make me feel better. She said it like a statement of absolute legal fact. Some families are broken, and broken families need a scapegoat so they don't have to look in the mirror at their own toxic behavior. It is not your fault. It never was your fault. I felt a sudden, aggressive, burning sensation behind my eyes. My vision blurred. I had to bite the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted blood, just to stop myself from breaking down and sobbing right there in the middle of the restaurant. Those words, "You are not the problem." It was the exact phrase I had been waiting my entire life to hear. It felt like a massive, suffocating weight had just been lifted off my chest. When the waiter finally brought the bill, I immediately reached for my wallet in my back pocket. Joseph literally slapped my hand away from the leather folder. "Put that away," Joseph ordered, pulling out his credit card. "You're a guest at my table. You don't pay for a damn thing today." As we all gathered our coats and walked out into the freezing snow, Martha stopped me on the sidewalk. She reached into her purse and handed me a thick, cream-colored business card. "We do Sunday dinners every single week at our house in Brookline. Nathan," she said, squeezing my arm, "you have a seat at our table whenever you want it. Don't be a stranger." I went home that night feeling a strange, unfamiliar warmth in my chest. But the real turning point, the moment that permanently severed my ties to my past, happened 2 days later. I was sitting in my apartment on Saturday morning, drinking coffee, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed it was Dylan, my older cousin on my dad's side. Dylan and I weren't incredibly close, but we usually grabbed a beer a few times a year. He was one of the only relatives who treated me somewhat normally. "Hey man," Dylan said as soon as I answered. He sounded nervous, his voice tight. "Happy late Thanksgiving. Listen, I need to ask you something, and I don't want you to freak out on me." "Okay," I said, putting my coffee mug down on the counter. "What is it? Did Aunt Margaret really ban you from Thanksgiving dinner because of Victoria's pregnancy?" he asked. I frowned, confused as to why he was asking. "Yeah. She called me on Wednesday and told me Gabriel didn't want any drama." Dylan let out a harsh, bitter laugh through the phone. "Nathan, buddy, I don't know how to tell you this, but that's not why they kept you away." My stomach instantly dropped into my shoes. "What do you mean?" "I was over at their house on Wednesday night to drop off a pie," Dylan said, lowering his voice to a whisper, like he was afraid someone in his own house was listening. "Victoria and your mom were drinking wine in the kitchen. They thought I was in the bathroom, but I overheard them talking." He paused, taking a deep breath. "Nathan, your grandmother's estate finally cleared probate last month. The lawyer released the funds. The inheritance was explicitly supposed to be split 50-50 between you and Gabriel." My heart started pounding violently against my ribs. My grandmother had passed away a year ago. My parents had taken total control of handling all the legal paperwork and the funeral arrangements. I had never seen a single dime of inheritance, and I never asked about it because I didn't want to seem greedy or cause an argument. Victoria really wanted Gabriel to buy that brand new luxury Porsche SUV before the baby arrived. Dylan continued, his voice laced with disgust. "She said they needed a safe, high-end family car. But Gabriel's salary wasn't enough to get approved for the loan, and they didn't have the cash for the down payment." I closed my eyes, feeling physically sick. I already knew what he was going to say. "Your mom convinced your dad to forge your signature on the release forms," Dylan said quietly. "They took your entire half of the inheritance money, tens of thousands of dollars, and used it as the down payment on Gabriel's Porsche. They banned you from Thanksgiving because they knew Gabriel was going to be showing off the new car to the whole family in the driveway. They were terrified you would ask how he paid for it, and the lie would fall apart." The room started spinning. I grabbed the edge of the kitchen counter to keep my balance. It wasn't about peace. It wasn't about Victoria's morning sickness. It wasn't about a baby. It was about money. It was about greed. They had literally stolen from me. They stole money that my grandmother had meant for my future, used it to fund my golden child brother's extravagant lifestyle, and then threw me out into the cold on a holiday so they wouldn't have to look me in the eye while they celebrated with my money. "Are you serious?" My voice was a deadly, quiet whisper. "I'm so sorry, man," Dylan said. "I thought you knew. I thought they bought you out or something. When I realized what they did, it's sickening." I didn't yell. I didn't throw my coffee mug against the wall. I didn't scream into a pillow. I just felt a profound, absolute stillness wash over my entire body. "Thanks for telling me, Dylan," I said calmly. I hung up the phone. I calmly walked into my bedroom, sat on the edge of my bed, and opened the Contacts app on my phone. I found Margaret's name, blocked. I found Charles's name, blocked. I found Gabriel's name, blocked. I went to my social media accounts and blocked Victoria and every flying monkey relative who worshipped the ground Gabriel walked on. I deleted their contact information from my cloud storage. At that exact moment, sitting in that quiet apartment, the Nathan they knew died. The desperate kid who wanted his parents' love ceased to exist. I was entirely, completely done. Time is a funny thing. When you take a scalpel and cut out a massive, toxic tumor from your life, you suddenly have all this incredible space to grow. You don't realize how much energy you spend trying to survive poison until the poison is gone. Over the next 2 years, I never looked back. I never unblocked their numbers. I never checked to see if they sent emails. I threw myself entirely into my life. Without the constant mental drain of my family's manipulation, my career skyrocketed. I got promoted to senior art director at my firm. I was managing massive accounts, pulling in a salary I never thought possible, and eventually bought a beautiful condo in the city. But the biggest, most important change in my life wasn't my bank account. It was where I spent my Sunday evenings. I took Martha up on her offer. The first time I knocked on the door of their beautiful Victorian house in Brookline, I felt terrified, but they simply wouldn't let me feel like a stranger. Every Sunday I was there. I helped Joseph fix the wooden deck in the backyard, holding the flashlight while he cursed at rusty screws. I drank cheap beers with Caleb and watched football in the basement. I stood in the kitchen with Martha, chopping vegetables and listening to her stories about her days as a lawyer. I didn't have to walk on eggshells. If I disagreed with Caleb about a movie, we argued about it loudly, laughed, and moved on. Nobody called me dramatic. Nobody told me I was ruining the peace. I was just allowed to exist as a normal human being. And then, about 6 months into my Sunday dinners, the front door opened, and Chloe walked in. Chloe was Martha's niece. She had been living in Chicago for years and had just transferred back to Boston to work as an architect. She had dark hair, a razor-sharp sense of humor, and a smile that hit me like a physical blow to the chest the very first second I saw her. We ended up standing in the kitchen for 3 hours that first night, completely ignoring the football game happening in the living room. We talked about art, about our careers, about the cities we wanted to travel to. I had never felt so instantly, effortlessly understood by another human being. Our relationship didn't have the chaotic, dramatic, burning sparks you see in movies. It was calm. It was safe. It was the feeling of finally taking a deep, full breath of air after being held underwater for 27 years. She knew my entire history. She knew I didn't speak to my blood relatives. And she never judged me for it. She never told me family is family. She just held my hand, kissed my forehead, and moved forward with me. 2.5 years after that miserable, lonely Thanksgiving, I found myself walking back into Harborview Grill. This time I wasn't alone. Chloe had insisted we go there for our anniversary. We were sitting in the exact same leather booth where Joseph and Martha had invited me over years ago. The waiter had just cleared our dinner plates, and I was about to look at the dessert menu when Chloe reached across the table and took both of my hands in hers. "Nathan," she said softly, her eyes shining in the dim restaurant light. "You told me once that this restaurant was the exact place where your life actually started, where you realized you didn't have to be alone." "It was," I said, smiling at her, rubbing my thumb over her knuckles. She reached into her purse, her hands shaking slightly, and pulled out a small velvet box. My jaw practically hit the table. She opened it, revealing a simple, elegant gold band. "I don't want you to ever feel alone again," she whispered, a tear slipping down her cheek and catching the light. "You are the greatest man I've ever known. I want to be your family. Will you marry me?" I couldn't even speak. The emotion caught in my throat so hard it hurt. I just nodded aggressively, wiping my own tears, and pulled her across the table to kiss her. The entire restaurant, including the waiters, erupted into loud applause. But as the wedding planning started a few months later, a dark, heavy cloud began to form in the back of my mind. We were sitting at the Morrisons' large dining table one evening after dinner, looking at thick stacks of sample wedding invitations. Chloe pointed to the standard, traditional layout on a beautiful piece of cardstock. "We need to figure out what to do here," she said gently, pointing to the top lines. "We need to fill in the parent names to formally invite the guests." I stared at the blank space on the paper. I felt physically sick, a cold knot forming in my stomach at the thought of putting Margaret and Charles on my wedding invitation. They didn't deserve the honor. They hadn't contributed a dime to my life. They weren't my parents. Martha, who was sitting across the table drinking herbal tea, set her mug down on a coaster. She looked at me with that sharp, analytical, lawyerly gaze that saw right through my anxiety. "Nathan," she said quietly, "you know, when I practiced family law, I didn't just handle messy divorces and custody battles. I handled adoptions." I looked up, confused. "Adoptions?" "Adult adoptions," she clarified, leaning forward. "In this state, if two consenting adults agree to the process, a person can be legally adopted by someone else, formally and permanently severing the legal ties to their biological parents. It issues a brand new birth certificate. It changes your legal next of kin status, completely rewrites your legal existence. It makes it official. The room went completely silent. Caleb stopped scrolling on his phone on the couch. Joseph looked at me, a soft, immensely proud smile spreading across his face. My heart hammered in my chest like a drum. I looked from Martha to Joseph. Are you saying? Martha reached across the wide table and grabbed my hand tightly. Nathan, we have considered you our son since the very first day you sat at our table in that restaurant. If you want it, if you're ready for it, Joseph and I would be honored beyond words to make it legal. I broke down. Right there at the kitchen table, surrounded by invitation samples and half-empty tea mugs, I buried my face in my hands and sobbed like a child. I wept for the boy who was never chosen, and I wept for the man who finally was. The legal process took about 3 months. We filed the paperwork, paid the court fees, and finally, we walked into a judge's chambers in downtown Boston. The judge read the decree, smiled warmly at us, and slammed his wooden gavel. I was no longer Nathan Carter, the forgotten, stolen from, invisible son. I walked out of that courthouse holding a brand new birth certificate. I was Nathan Morrison. And that legal document, that piece of paper that completely erased them from my existence, is exactly what my biological parents did not know about when they decided to bust through the doors and crash my wedding. Fan 5. The explosive truth: the morning of my wedding day in Napa Valley was supposed to be completely perfect. And for the first few hours, it genuinely was. I woke up early in the groom's suite of the sprawling stone estate we had rented for the weekend. The air in California was crisp, smelling faintly of crushed grapes and dry earth. I stood out on the balcony holding a cup of black coffee, looking out over the endless rows of green vines that stretched all the way to the horizon. I was 32 years old. I had a career I was incredibly proud of. I was about to marry the most brilliant, compassionate woman I had ever met. And I was surrounded by a family who actually wanted me there. Joseph walked out onto the balcony, holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee. He was already wearing his crisp white dress shirt and suspenders, his silver hair perfectly combed back. He stood next to me, leaning his forearms against the stone railing, and let out a long, contented sigh. "You nervous, son?" Joseph asked, his voice low and steady. I shook my head, smiling. "Not about marrying Chloe. That is the easiest decision I've ever made in my entire life. I'm just hoping the catering staff got the seating chart right. Caleb changed his table assignment 3 times last night." Joseph laughed, a rich, booming sound. "Don't worry about Caleb. Martha has him on a tight leash today. This day is about you and Chloe. You've earned this happiness, Nathan. Never forget that. You fought hard to build this life." I looked at him, the man who had taken me in from a lonely corner table at a restaurant and legally made me his son. I felt a lump form in my throat. "Thank you, Dad." Saying the word Dad to Joseph felt as natural as breathing. It didn't feel forced. It didn't carry the heavy, suffocating weight of guilt and fear that it used to carry when I spoke to Charles. We went back inside to finish getting dressed. Caleb, my newly legally adopted brother and my best man, was already wrestling with his bow tie in the mirror. But sitting on the leather couch in the corner of the room was my cousin, Dylan. I had invited Dylan to the wedding because he was the one who had finally told me the truth about the stolen inheritance money 5 years ago. I thought we had built a solid mutual respect. I thought he understood why I had to cut my biological parents out of my life. But all morning, Dylan had been acting incredibly strange. He was sweating through his undershirt. He kept pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor. And he could not stop staring at his phone. Every time it buzzed, he would flinch, quickly type out a message, and immediately shove the phone deep into his pocket, looking around nervously to see if anyone was watching him. I was adjusting my cufflinks when there was a sharp knock on the heavy wooden door of the suite. Ryan stepped into the room. Ryan was the head of the private security firm Chloe and I had hired for the weekend. He was a tall, heavily built guy with short hair and a very serious, no-nonsense demeanor. We had hired security primarily to manage the parking and keep the paparazzi away from some of the higher-profile guests, like my firm's CEO, Arthur, who had flown in from Boston. Mr. Morrison, Ryan said, looking directly at me. He completely ignored everyone else in the room. Do you have 5 minutes to speak with me in the hallway? It's highly urgent. A cold chill ran down my spine. I nodded, setting my suit jacket on the bed, and followed Ryan out into the quiet, carpeted hallway. He gently closed the door behind us, making sure it clicked shut. Ryan pulled a sleek black tablet out from under his arm and tapped the screen a few times. Sir, we have a perimeter breach at the main gate, Ryan said, his voice completely flat and professional. A rental car pulled up about 10 minutes ago. 3 individuals. 2 older adults, 1 younger male. They were not on the approved guest list. The guard at the gate denied them entry. My heart stopped. My mouth went completely dry. Do you have a visual? Ryan handed me the tablet. It was a live feed from the security camera mounted at the iron gates at the bottom of the estate's driveway. I stared at the high-definition screen. There she was. My mother, Margaret. She was wearing a dark, heavy dress, pointing her finger aggressively at the security guard's chest, her mouth moving a mile a minute. Behind her stood my brother, Gabriel. He was pacing back and forth, looking furious, occasionally kicking the gravel driveway. My father, Charles, was leaning against the hood of the rental car, looking utterly defeated and embarrassed. They are currently demanding access, Ryan continued calmly. The older female claims to be your biological mother. She is threatening to call the local police and report us for kidnapping if we do not let her through. The younger male has also made several physical threats against my staff. I have an extraction team on standby. Give me the word, and I will have local law enforcement remove them for criminal trespassing immediately. I stared at the tablet. My hands started to shake, not from fear, but from a sudden, blinding surge of adrenaline and anger. 5 years. 5 years of absolute silence. They had stolen from me, they had erased me from their family, they had completely ignored my existence. And now, on the single most important day of my life, they had flown across the country to try and ruin it. I looked up at Ryan. How did they even know where the venue was? The invitations were strictly confidential. Ryan's eyes narrowed slightly. He tapped the tablet screen again, switching to a different camera feed. This one showed the parking lot area from about 20 minutes ago. I was reviewing the footage from this morning, Ryan said. I noticed one of your guests acting highly suspicious. He walked out to the edge of the property line, where cell reception is strongest, and made a phone call. He also texted the exact GPS coordinates of the estate's front gate. He zoomed in on the footage. It was Dylan. The betrayal hit me like a physical punch to the gut. Dylan had played the role of the sympathetic cousin perfectly. He had spent the last 2 days drinking my expensive wine, eating my catered food, and looking me in the eye while secretly feeding my location to the very people who had destroyed my childhood. He was a spy. He was a coward who still craved Margaret's approval more than he valued my friendship. Do you want me to detain the guest, sir? Ryan asked. I took a deep, shuddering breath. I looked back down at the live feed of Margaret screaming at the gate guard. The old Nathan, the weak, people-pleasing kid who just wanted to keep the peace, would have panicked. The old Nathan would have let Ryan call the police to quietly drag them away so nobody would find out about the messy family drama. But I wasn't that kid anymore. I was Nathan Morrison, and Morrisons do not hide. I handed the tablet back to Ryan. A cold, absolute certainty settled over me. No, I said quietly. Don't call the police. Tell the gate guard to let their car through. I want you to escort them into the reception hall. But do not let them anywhere near the actual wedding ceremony. Keep them confined to the back of the reception building until dinner starts. Ryan looked surprised for a fraction of a second, but his professional mask quickly returned. Are you absolutely certain, sir? They seem highly volatile. I'm certain, I said, a dark smile forming on my lips. They came here to put on a show. Let's give them front row seats. I walked back into the groom's suite. Dylan looked up at me, his eyes darting nervously. "Everything okay, Nathan?" I looked him dead in the eye. "Everything is absolutely perfect, Dylan. Better than I could have ever hoped." The ceremony itself took place in a beautiful, open-air courtyard surrounded by blooming rose bushes. When the string quartet started playing and Chloe walked down the stone path in her white dress, everything else in the world completely faded away. I forgot about Margaret. I forgot about Gabriel. I forgot about the impending storm. All I saw was the woman who had reached out and pulled me out of the darkness. When we exchanged our vows, I couldn't stop crying. I looked out at the audience. Joseph and Martha were sitting in the front row. Martha was dabbing her eyes with a tissue, and Joseph was beaming with pride. They were my family. This was real. After the ceremony, the guests moved into the massive stone reception hall for dinner and speeches. The room was breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers hung from the wooden beams, and the tables were covered in white linen, candles, and expensive floral arrangements. I took my seat next to Chloe at the head table. The energy in the room was electric. People were laughing, drinking champagne, and celebrating. But out of the corner of my eye, I saw Ryan standing near the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall. He gave me a single, curt nod. I leaned over and whispered into Chloe's ear, "They're here." Chloe's eyes widened. She instinctively reached out and gripped my hand under the table. "Are you okay? Do you want Ryan to throw them out right now?" "No," I whispered back, kissing her cheek. "Just watch." The master of ceremonies, a charismatic guy with a deep voice, tapped his microphone, signaling for the room to quiet down. The soft acoustic background music faded out. "Ladies and gentlemen," the MC announced, his voice echoing through the massive hall. "Before we get to the dinner service, we have some very special introductions to make. If I could have your attention on the center stage." I stood up, brushing a hand down my suit jacket, and walked over to the center stage. I took the microphone from the MC. I looked out over the sea of faces. Hundreds of my colleagues, friends, and the Morrison family were watching me with warm, expectant smiles. Sitting at table number 1, right near the front, was Arthur, the billionaire CEO of the tech firm my agency represented. He raised his glass to me. And then, I looked all the way to the back of the room. The heavy oak doors were pushed slightly open. Standing in the shadows, waiting for their moment, were Margaret, Charles, and Gabriel. They were practically vibrating with angry energy. They were waiting for me to falter. They were waiting for me to acknowledge them, to apologize for not inviting them, to beg for their forgiveness in front of my wealthy friends. I brought the microphone to my lips. "Thank you all for being here today," I said, my voice steady and loud. "This day is about love. But more importantly, this day is about family." And for a very long time, I did not know what that word actually meant. I saw Margaret take a step forward out of the shadows, a smug look crossing her face. She thought I was about to apologize to her. She thought I was about to invite her up to the stage. I spent the first 27 years of my life believing that family meant walking on eggshells. I continued, keeping my eyes locked onto Margaret's face at the back of the room. I thought family meant shrinking yourself down so you wouldn't take up too much space. I thought family meant giving up your own birthday parties, missing your own college graduations, and having your grandmother's inheritance money stolen from you just so someone else could buy a luxury car. A collective gasp rippled through the reception hall. The room went dead silent. Arthur lowered his champagne glass, his eyes narrowing in interest. Dylan, sitting at a table near the middle, went completely pale. Margaret froze. The smug look on her face vanished, replaced by a look of sheer panic. Gabriel's jaw dropped. "I thought that was normal," I said, my voice rising in power. "Until one Thanksgiving, when I was told not to come home because I was an inconvenience. I sat in a restaurant alone, and a family at the next table saw me. They didn't know me. They owed me nothing, but they invited me to sit with them, and they never let me go." I turned toward the front row. "So, before we celebrate anything else tonight, I want to formally introduce the two most important people in my life. The people who taught me what unconditional love actually looks like. Ladies and gentlemen, Please stand and raise your glasses for the parents of the groom, Joseph and Martha Morrison. The reaction was instantaneous. CO Arthur was the first person out of his chair. He stood up, clapping loudly, his booming voice yelling out a cheer. Within 3 seconds, the entire reception hall was on its feet. 150 people were giving a standing ovation. Joseph stood up, pulling Martha into his arms, tears streaming down both of their faces. They waved to the crowd, radiating pure joy. At the back of the room, Margaret completely lost her mind. The illusion she had built for herself shattered into a million pieces. She could not handle being ignored. She could not handle not being the center of attention. "Stop the music!" Margaret screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice shrill and desperate. She shoved past Ryan and began marching down the center aisle, her heavy dress swishing violently. Gabriel and Charles followed right behind her. The clapping slowly died down as the guests realized this wasn't part of the show. People stared in shock as this furious woman marched toward the stage. "What is the meaning of this, Nathan?" Margaret shouted, pointing a shaking finger up at me. "How dare you? How dare you stand there and introduce those strangers as your parents? We are your family. I gave birth to you. You owe us respect." Gabriel stepped up next to the stage, cracking his knuckles, trying to look intimidating. "You think you can just erase us, man? We're your parents and your brother. You're making a fool of yourself in front of all these people." I stood on the edge of the stage, looking down at them. I felt no fear. I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical disgust. "You're wrong, Gabriel," I said into the microphone. My voice echoed through the silent room. Every single guest heard me perfectly. "I'm not making a fool of myself. I am exposing you." I turned to look directly at Margaret. Her face was red and blotchy with rage. "You claim to be my mother," I said calmly. "But you are legally a stranger to me." Margaret blinked, visibly confused. "What are you talking about? Stop talking nonsense." 3 years ago, I said, my voice dripping with absolute authority, I walked into a courthouse in downtown Boston. I stood before a judge and I signed legal documents. I went through the process of adult adoption. My legal name is Nathan Morrison. My legal next of kin, my legal parents, the names on my new birth certificate, are Joseph and Martha Morrison. The silence in the room was deafening. You could hear the wind blowing outside the stone walls. Margaret's mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land. The color drained completely from her face. You can't do that. You can't just legally replace me. That's illegal." "It is perfectly legal," Martha said, standing up from her table. She walked up to the edge of the stage, adjusting her glasses, looking at Margaret with the terrifying, cold precision of a veteran lawyer. "I handled the paperwork myself. Your parental rights, whatever little you actually exercised, were permanently and legally severed. You have absolutely no legal standing in Nathan's life. You are a trespasser." Gabriel let out a roar of anger. He lunged toward the steps of the stage, aiming right for me. "I'm going to knock your teeth out, you ungrateful little brat." He didn't make it past the second step. Caleb, who had played defensive linebacker in college, stepped right into Gabriel's path. He shoved Gabriel hard in the chest, sending him stumbling backward into a chair. Joseph stepped up right beside Caleb, crossing his arms, looking like an absolute brick wall. "You take one more step toward my son," Joseph growled, his voice deep and menacing, "and I promise you, you will leave this vineyard in an ambulance. The Morrison family protects its own." Gabriel froze, looking terrified. He was used to bullying me when I was a kid. He had never actually faced a real man who was willing to fight back. I looked down at Charles, my biological father. He hadn't said a word. He was just staring at his shoes, trembling slightly. "You stood by and let them steal my inheritance to buy that luxury SUV," I said, addressing Charles directly. He flinched at the word, inheritance. Several guests gasped. "You let her ban me from Thanksgiving. You let her treat me like garbage for nearly 3 decades. I hope the peace you kept was worth it, Charles, because it cost you a son." Charles finally looked up at me. A single tear rolled down his cheek. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. He just looked completely, utterly broken. This is the moment that changes everything, the moment I finally took back control of my life. Thank you so much for your patience and for staying with me until now. You've been amazing. Please give this video a like and comment one below to let me know you've made it this far. Not only does this help more people find this story, but it also lets me know that my experiences truly mean something to someone. Your support is my greatest motivation to keep sharing the rest of this journey. Fan 6. Escorting the trash, I gave a simple nod to the back of the room. Ryan and his security team descended instantly. Four massive guys in dark suits surrounded Margaret, Charles, and Gabriel. Ryan stepped right into Margaret's personal space. "Ma'am," Ryan said firmly, "you are trespassing on a private event. You will leave the premises immediately, or I will have the local sheriff arrest you." Margaret looked around wildly. She looked at the faces of the wealthy guests, hoping someone would step in and defend a poor, victimized mother. But she saw nothing but disgust. Arthur, the CEO, was glaring at her with absolute contempt. "Get your hands off me!" Margaret shrieked as one of the security guards gently but firmly grabbed her arm. "This is an outrage. I am his mother. You will all pay for this." Gabriel tried to puff out his chest again, but a security guard simply placed a heavy hand on his shoulder and physically turned him toward the exit. Charles didn't fight back at all. He just let the guards guide him away, his head hanging in total shame. As they were being frog-marched down the center aisle, Margaret kept screaming, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "You're making a mistake. Nathan, you'll regret this. You are nothing without us." I watched them disappear through the heavy oak doors. The doors slammed shut behind them, cutting off her hysterical screaming entirely. The reception hall was absolutely silent. The tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. People were exchanging shocked glances. I kept the microphone in my hand. I walked off the stage and over to table number 6. I stopped right behind Dylan's chair. Dylan was sweating profusely. He was staring down at his empty plate, refusing to look up at me. "Dylan," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion. He slowly turned his head. "Nathan, man, I swear I didn't." "You leaked the GPS coordinates to them this morning," I said loudly, making sure the entire room heard exactly what kind of man he was. "You drank my wine, you ate my food, and you tried to ruin my wedding for a woman who doesn't even respect you. Stand up." Dylan swallowed hard. He looked around the table. Nobody was looking at him with an ounce of sympathy. He slowly stood up, pushing his chair back. "Leave," I commanded, pointing toward the back doors. "And if you ever contact me again, I will have Martha file a restraining order against you before you can even hit send. Get out of my sight." Dylan didn't say a single word. He kept his head down, grabbed his suit jacket off the back of his chair, and practically sprinted down the aisle and out the doors. I stood there in the middle of the room. The toxic waste had been completely removed. My past was finally, permanently gone. I took a deep breath, feeling the air fill my lungs. Felt lighter, felt incredibly clean. I walked back up to the front, handed the microphone to the MC, and turned to Chloe. She stood up, wrapped her arms around my neck, and kissed me deeply. "You handled that perfectly," she whispered against my lips. CO Arthur stood up again. He raised his champagne glass high into the air. "To Nathan and Chloe Morrison," Arthur bellowed, his voice carrying immense weight. "And to the trash taking itself out." The entire room exploded into cheers and laughter. Glasses clinked. The tension vanished instantly, replaced by a wave of pure, unadulterated relief and joy. The sound technician immediately blasted a fast, upbeat song, and people rushed the dance floor. The rest of the night was a blur of incredible happiness. I danced with Chloe until my feet hurt. I did a shot of whiskey with Caleb. I hugged Joseph and Martha. There was no drama. There was no tension. There was just family. Real family. Fan 7. The letter and the legacy: we spent 2 weeks on our honeymoon in Italy, drinking wine on the Amalfi Coast and completely disconnecting from the world. We didn't check social media. We didn't answer emails. It was paradise. When we finally flew back to Boston and unlocked the door to our condo, reality started to set back in. But it was a good reality. I dropped our suitcases in the hallway and went to the kitchen to sort through the massive pile of mail that had accumulated on our counter while we were gone. Mostly it was bills, junk mail, and a few late wedding gifts. But near the bottom of the stack, there was a plain white envelope. There was no return address, just my name written in neat, elegant, cursive handwriting that I faintly recognized. I opened the envelope with a butter knife and pulled out a 2-page letter written on thick stationery. I unfolded it and looked at the signature at the bottom. Aunt Mary. Mary was Charles's younger sister. I hadn't seen her in nearly a decade. She lived out on the West Coast and always kept her distance from Margaret's tyrannical grip on the family. I sat down on a bar stool at the kitchen island and began to read. Dear Nathan, I heard about what happened at the wedding through the family grapevine. I know it must have been an incredibly painful scene, but I am writing this to tell you something very important. I am so immensely proud of you. You need to know a piece of history that your father has been too cowardly to tell you. 5 years ago, when Margaret banned you from Thanksgiving over that ridiculous car payment situation, Charles actually tried to fight back. He called me that night, crying. He felt terribly guilty about forging your signature on that inheritance paperwork. He told me he was going to buy a plane ticket and fly to Boston to spend Thanksgiving with you in secret. But Margaret found out. She caught him looking up flights. Nathan, she completely lost her mind. She threatened him with an immediate divorce. She told him she would hire the most ruthless lawyer in the state and fight for full custody of his pension, the house, and every single asset he had worked for his entire life. She told him if he got on that plane to see you, she would leave him with absolutely nothing. Charles was terrified of a brutal divorce. He was terrified of losing his comfortable life. So he backed down. He chose his financial safety over his son. I haven't spoken to my brother since that day. I am telling you this not to make you forgive him, but to give you absolute peace. You deserved a braver father. You deserved a man who would risk everything to protect you. Charles was not that man. You did the right thing by walking away. Congratulations on your marriage, and congratulations on your new family. You earned them. With love, Aunt Mary. I set the letter down on the granite counter. I stared out the kitchen window at the Boston skyline. I thought I would feel a surge of anger. I thought reading about Charles's betrayal in black and white would make my blood boil all over again. But surprisingly, I just felt a profound sense of pity. Charles was a hostage to his own cowardice. He would spend the rest of his miserable life trapped in a loveless, toxic marriage with Margaret, watching Gabriel drain whatever money they had left. That was his punishment, and I didn't need to be a part of it anymore. I threw the letter in the trash can, washed my hands, and went into the bedroom to help Chloe unpack. I was finally truly free. Flash forward 1 year. Life has a beautiful way of rewarding you when you finally refuse to accept toxicity. My career exploded. 6 months after the wedding, I was promoted to creative director at my agency. My salary practically doubled overnight. I was managing a massive team, designing campaigns for Fortune 500 companies, and actually enjoying every single day of my work. With the new salary, Chloe and I decided it was time to leave the loud city behind. We bought a beautiful, historic 4-bedroom house in Brookline. It had a massive backyard, a wraparound porch, and perfectly manicured oak trees. The best part? It was exactly 4 streets away from Joseph and Martha's house. And we needed the extra bedrooms because exactly 1 year after our wedding in Napa, Chloe handed me a small white stick with 2 pink lines on it. The pregnancy journey was incredible. We didn't have to deal with Margaret constantly criticizing Chloe's weight or demanding to control the baby shower. We just experienced the pure joy of bringing a new life into the world, surrounded by people who supported us. Martha insisted on knitting dozens of tiny sweaters, and Caleb started buying miniature football jerseys before we even knew the gender. On a rainy Tuesday night in late October, my phone rang. It was Chloe's doctor. We rushed to the hospital. After 14 grueling, exhausting hours in the delivery room, holding Chloe's hand and coaching her through every contraction, I finally heard the most beautiful sound in the universe. A sharp, loud, healthy cry. The nurse wrapped our baby boy in a warm blanket and handed him to Chloe. She was crying, her face flushed and exhausted, looking down at this tiny, perfect human being. I leaned my forehead against hers, tears streaming down my own face. An hour later, there was a soft knock on the door of our recovery room. Joseph and Martha walked in, holding massive bouquets of flowers and balloons. They looked nervous, like they were afraid to interrupt. "Come in, Mom." "Come in, Dad," I said, waving them over to the bed. Martha walked up to the edge of the bed, her hands clasped over her mouth, tears already welling up behind her glasses. Joseph stood right beside her, resting his large hand softly on my shoulder. "Oh, Nathan," Martha whispered, looking down at the sleeping baby in Chloe's arms. "He is absolutely perfect. He's beautiful. Do you want to hold him?" Chloe asked, smiling gently. Martha looked at me for permission. I nodded eagerly. Chloe carefully transferred the tiny bundle into Martha's arms. Joseph leaned over his wife's shoulder, looking down at the baby with a look of pure, unguarded awe. "Have you two decided on a name yet?" Joseph asked, his voice thick with emotion. I looked at Chloe. We had made the decision months ago. We didn't even have to debate it. "Yeah, we did," I said. I stood up and wrapped my arm around Joseph's shoulders. "Mom, Dad, we want you to meet your grandson, Joseph Morrison, Jr." Joseph physically staggered backward. His breath hitched in his chest. He looked from me to the baby and then back to me. The big, stoic, tough man broke down completely. He buried his face in his hands and wept openly in the middle of the hospital room. Martha was sobbing, holding the baby close to her chest. I had been named after a grandfather on Charles's side who I never met and didn't care about. My name never meant anything. But my son's name? His name carried legacy. His name carried honor. His name belonged to a man who saw a broken, lonely kid sitting in the back of a restaurant and decided to save his life. Fan 8, the table we built 5 years. It had been exactly 5 years since that freezing, lonely Thanksgiving day when my mother told me not to come home. I was standing in the massive, warm kitchen of Joseph and Martha's house in Brookline. The air was thick with the incredible smell of roasting turkey, fresh sage, and baking pie crusts. The house was absolute chaos, in the best possible way. Caleb's 3 kids were running laps around the kitchen island, chasing our little Joey, who was now a very fast, very energetic toddler. Chloe and Sarah were standing at the counter, drinking wine and laughing hysterically about a story from work. Joseph was sitting in his recliner in the living room, yelling at the television screen because the Patriots had just fumbled the ball. It was loud. It was messy. It was everything a holiday was supposed to be. Martha bumped her hip against mine as she carried a massive bowl of mashed potatoes toward the dining room. "Grab the gravy boat, Nathan. If we don't feed these animals soon, Caleb is going to start eating the raw vegetables." I laughed, picking up the silver gravy boat. I followed her into the dining room. The dining table was fully extended, taking up the entire room. It was covered in mismatched plates, slightly chipped wine glasses, and a massive feast. I looked around the table. There were no empty chairs. Everyone took their seats. The noise level was deafening as plates were passed around and people started arguing playfully over who got the dark meat. I tapped my fork against my wine glass. The sharp clinking sound cut through the noise, and the table slowly went quiet. Everyone looked at me. Joseph lowered his fork. Chloe smiled at me, holding little Joey on her lap. I stood up, holding my glass of wine. I looked around at these incredible people. 5 years ago today, I started, my voice steady and clear. I was sitting by myself at a tiny table near the kitchen doors of Harborview Grill. I thought my life was over. I thought there was something fundamentally, irreversibly wrong with me because the people who brought me into this world didn't want me in it. I looked at Martha. She was already wiping a tear from behind her glasses. I thought family meant blood. I continued. I thought you were stuck with the hand you were dealt, no matter how much it hurt you. But then a woman walked up to my table and told me that no one should have to eat alone. You didn't just give me a meal that day. You gave me a life. You gave me a name. You gave me a future. I raised my glass higher. To the Morrisons, I said loudly, family isn't where we are born. It's where we choose to belong, and where they choose us back. Happy Thanksgiving. Happy Thanksgiving. The table roared back in unison. Glasses clinked. The laughter started again, louder and warmer than before. I sat back down in my chair, grabbed my wife's hand under the table, and finally felt completely, undeniably whole. Thank you for sticking around and listening to my story. I know it was a long one, and I know it got pretty heavy at times. But I shared this because I know there are people out there right now sitting in a lonely room, wondering if they are the problem. I hope this resonated with you in some way. I hope it showed you that you don't have to stay at a table where respect is no longer being served. You have the power to stand up, walk away, and build your own table. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation? Have you ever had to walk away from toxic family members to protect your own peace? Let me know down in the comments. I read every single one of them, and I try to reply to as many as I can. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, you are officially part of the 1% Club. I want you to go down to the comments section right now and just type the letter W. W stands for winner. That is our secret code. It lets me know that you are part of that amazing group of people who stick through the tough parts of a story to see the triumph at the end. You guys are the absolute best. Please don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. And hit follow so you don't miss out on any future stories. I have a lot more to share with you all. Stay strong, keep protecting your peace, and I will see you in the next video.